All right, I think it's good for us to get things underway because we only have a very short hour to discuss this important topic today, and lots of things, lots of great material to get to, I have no doubt. So first and foremost, I just want to say an official welcome to everyone joining us. Thank you for coming to the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics webinar on AI fairness and transparency. I'm Rebecca Tromble. I'm the director of IDDP. Our institute launched at George Washington University in 2019 with generous support from the Knight Foundation. IDDP's mission is to help the public, journalists, and policymakers understand digital media's influence on public dialogue and opinion, as well as to develop sound solutions to disinformation and other ills that arise in digital spaces. So as part of that mission, IDDP is engaging with leading scholars, with journalists, practitioners, policymakers, other researchers on some of the most pressing issues of the day. And today, that includes the need for transparency, fairness, accountability in the design and implementation of artificial intelligence, or AI. Algorithmic bias and AI fairness have been grabbing headlines in recent weeks, as we've seen Google fire the two team leads, both women, of its ethical artificial intelligence team. And a recent article by Karen Howe in the MIT Technology Review highlighted concerns about what Facebook does and does not prioritize in its responsible AI team. So with this as background to our conversation, I'm incredibly pleased to welcome two distinguished panelists to discuss this topic in much greater detail. I'll begin by introducing and asking a question of each in turn. And after each has offered a few opening thoughts, I'm then going to open things up to a wider conversation. For those in the audience, please know that I'll do my best to keep an eye on questions that come in. But please, so please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature. But I do ask that you use that feature rather than chat, because the tendency is for anything that comes into chat to very quickly get buried under other questions and remarks. But now let me kick things off by turning to Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee, who is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute, is the director of the Center for Technology and Innovation, and serves as co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank. She works on issues of algorithmic bias detection and mitigation, with a focus on protected classes in the US. Dr. Turner-Lee's most recent publications address biases in machine learning algorithms, the digital divide, 5G mobile infrastructure, and telehealth. And her forthcoming book, which she was just telling us before we started up the webinar, is just about to be finished within a matter of days, and is titled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, and takes a look at the impacts of digital exclusion and machine learning algorithms on vulnerable consumers. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Turner-Lee.
Thank you.
To start us off, I'd like to think about, well, let me put it this way. The concept of AI fairness is really, probably to understate the case, complex. And recent debates have focused on what engineers, researchers, policymakers, and others should consider first and foremost, should really prioritize in the development and use of fair and equitable AI. So I'm hoping that you might lead us into our discussion by sharing some of your thoughts about what AI fairness can and should mean, and where we really need to focus our attention most urgently.
Yeah. Well, no, thanks for having me. And I'm excited to have this conversation today. This is one of the areas that, if it's not related to digital divide in my book, I sleep, dream, and breathe about, because I think it has huge implications if we don't check these technologies that have the potential to widen the existing systemic inequalities. So when we talk about this idea of fairness, let me first go to this question of society. As a sociologist who works in this space, it's very clear, and it should be clear to most of us, that society is not fair. And so when you're dealing with a systemic and structural conditions that actually sort of permeate and disqualify certain peoples based on their race or their gender or their sexual orientation, et cetera, you actually deal with the premise of many of these models, which, one, come with the values, biases, norms, and assumptions of the developers. And so based on where you live, who you are, what you've been exposed to, that's sort of the premise for how you design and develop. We all do it. It's just part of our nature because that's the way society is. But there's a potential for those types of biases to be baked into the models that are actually being deployed into society. So what we're finding, as I get into your question of fairness, we're seeing models develop as machine learning algorithms just become part of the oxygen in which we all breathe, which are making determinations for people. And in some cases, the determination is very innocuous. You know, what color shoe should I buy or what toy should I get for my child for a holiday? And in other cases, it's making determinations around one's credit or their credit worthiness, ability to get housing, the rejection or acceptance of a loan, and in the case of criminal justice, whether or not they should be incarcerated for this length of time or another set of time or given this level of bail. To me, it's that part of it that is very problematic, and that's where I center my work. How do we actually create models in the algorithmic economy that do not go back in and sort of regress on all the civil rights progress that we've made? So when you begin to look at this concept of fairness, and I'll sort of wrap up here to get Bob to jump in, I always tell people it's a very elusive concept. I mean, what fairness means to me is different from what it might mean from Rebecca or any other person. And it's often the case among engineers that they've created these models where, yes, they've been able to sort of reduce the variance or the discrepancies from a technical standpoint, but they're overlaying those models on already flawed systems. So we may have, for example, a criminal justice algorithm that is highly determinate and predictive of whether or not a person should be released or detained. But that model is still playing out over a flawed criminal justice system that unfortunately over criminalize, over arrest people of color, particularly Black people. So, you know, when you ask that question, Rebecca, I always tell people part of this conversation that we need to be having is, you know, not just one around interdisciplinary context and the context in which these algorithms are framed and whether or not a decision should even be automated. But the other conversation should be, what are we comfortable with when we look at how these models play out in the real world and the extent to which that they may be technologically sound in terms of their cadence, but they're actually contributing to the worsening systemic effects that are already playing out among particular groups in certain populations. So I'll stop there. I mean, I tell people all the time, I can debate fairness up and down. For me, it becomes a matter of who's at the table when you're actually trying to discuss fairness. And so if you only have a scientist and you don't have a sociologist like myself, or you don't have a privacy or an ethicist, you land up making decisions that we've seen played out on the front page of newspapers that essentially deny or foreclose on opportunities for certain populations because, you know, it's usually, I call it, it's a move from permissionless innovation to permissionless forgiveness. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I didn't know that was going to happen. Well, you got to just look at society. You would have probably figured out that that was actually going to be the impact. So I'll stop there and let my colleague jump in. But I think for our work at Brookings, we're really intentionally looking at how do we create more interdisciplinary systems and contexts from which to look at some of the more sensitive use cases that in many respects create these consequences that are hard to sort of retrack and take back for individual consumers.
That's a really great place for us to start things off. And I particularly like the way that you ask the question about who's ultimately at the table, right? As essentially the starting point for us. Before we dig into that and some other things a bit more, I want to give Professor Robert Brauneis an opportunity to say a few opening remarks. Professor Brauneis is the Michael J. McKeon Professor of Intellectual Property Law and co-director of the Intellectual Property Program at the George Washington University Law School. He's also an affiliate of our institute, IDDP. His teaching and scholarly interests include artificial intelligence, algorithmic governance, copyright, trademark, property, and constitutional law. Professor Brauneis is the co-author of a leading casebook on copyright law, as well as co-author of Algorithmic Transparency for the Smart City, a study which tested the limits of transparency around governmental deployment of predictive algorithms at the state and local level. Professor Brauneis, you've done some really interesting work on the issues of AI fairness and transparency as they relate to governmental agencies and bodies. Do you think that the public sector is looking at these issues in different ways, different from other sectors? And what do you think public actors need to be thinking of when they're considering AI fairness and transparency? What are the priorities? What should they be?
Oh, wow, those are 2 or 3 or 4 great questions all bundled up in one. But that gives me an opportunity to expound, I guess, for a couple of minutes. As whether public authorities are looking differently at deploying and developing and deploying predictive algorithms, I think that they probably should be, because for 2 reasons. One, I think that ultimately in a democratic society, they should sort of embody or play to a value of transparency, that ultimately accountability should be for them not just a question of market, but a question of being responsible to the citizens. And also, I think there's a difference in that the state is supposed to have a monopoly on violence, which is to say, right, only the state is able to forcibly imprison somebody and take away their rights and that sort of thing. And that kind of power, I think, gives rise to a different kind of responsibility and a deeper responsibility than maybe private companies have. I think that's the source, if any, of differing responsibility, are democratic accountability on the one hand, and the kind of state power that states have on the other hand. In terms of what state actors, what governmental agencies should be looking at, they absolutely should be looking at fairness in all the ways that Dr. Turner-Lee was talking about. And that does include sort of technical measures of fairness. And I think that there are important technical questions to discuss about different measures of fairness that one could use and what are appropriate, but also the other layers of fairness that Dr. Turner-Lee mentioned. Namely, we have to look at, is this tool being used in the way that it was originally conceived of, or has it been kind of mission creep, and it's being used in a way that is not faithful to its original purpose? We may get around to discussing the compass, which is a quite famous or infamous sort of case study in predictive algorithms. In this case, a predictive algorithm that was originally designed, as the acronym stands for, it was originally designed to enable alternative sanctions that were less than imprisonment. Right? It's correctional offender profiling for alternative sanctions. And the idea, well, who could possibly object to that if we are the whole purpose of this is to enable certain people to be given less than confinement. Let's parole some people who are or otherwise would be confined in prison. But by the time it gets to litigation in one sort of now, I think, famous case of decided by the Supreme Court of Wisconsin, State versus Loomis, and ongoing litigation in Wisconsin, the use there is actually to in sentencing. So not in decisions about parole and letting people out of prison, but should we perhaps put this person in prison for longer because we're afraid that they're going to commit more crimes or whatever. So there's an example of huge mission creep that I think is fairly discussed or reasonably discussed as a kind of unfairness, right? And I think that there are other layers of fairness. Dr. Turnerly mentioned, systemic bias. That can also, we have to think about how systemic bias creeps into the training data, because people are making decisions that were biased, and it turns out that that's in the training data that you are training the algorithm on. So all those are worries. I just want to end on one, I think, sort of possibly positive comment about algorithms. And that is that I think in some cases, they may actually lessen bias or discrimination. And one important perspective is to think of this comparatively. Not, is this algorithm perfect, but how are these decisions being made previously? And once a predictive algorithm is introduced into the previous decision workflow, is it actually kind of cautioning people against making decisions that were previously more biased? And so I don't want to suggest that all use of predictive algorithms is terrible and we ought to stop it, or it's all bad. I really think we do need to think about the comparative point of view, and how we compare a decision-making system in which a predictive algorithm is one part of it to what was happening before.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And there are a number of questions that I have arising from both of the sort of opening remarks that the two of you have given. But before I get into those, I actually wanted to ask, I think I'll ask Dr. Turner-Lee to provide just a little bit of clarification for our audience, because I think we have a number of students who are among our attendees. And both you and Professor Braunice talked about training data, right? And the training data having these biases. Would you mind in just a few short sentences explaining what we mean when we talk about training data?
Yeah, and that was my oversight. I'm known for actually taking these very complex issues in tech policy and making it easy for lay people to understand. Let me do this, Rebecca, and then I'll talk about the training data and I usually have a chart that I show, but I'll just explain it real quickly. I think when the both of us are talking about algorithms and the comment I made about them being very ubiquitous, we're talking about things like you're watching a movie, you get a recommendation. That's a positioning algorithm. We're talking about you may purchase something and you go back and there's recommendations that show up and say, hey, you like this, you should like this. I think, again, those are very innocuous. How we've defined bias at Brookings, which I think is becoming commonly accepted, is when similarly situated people, places, and objects receive different treatment or have disparate impact. And so that means that if I'm similar to Rebecca and we both like to buy pretty earrings, right? But in some way, and this is where I think the algorithmic economy is really interesting, it finds out that Rebecca may like, apples and I might like oranges. And then over time, it picks up, like I tell people it's like a steak at the bottom of an ocean. It picks up all the granules of inferences that actually come. And when we see differential treatment, hey, I want to see a different movie than Rebecca. I might like a different set of earrings. That's fine. But when the machine begins to see that we have differences, not by gender, but by race or by age or children, we begin to see similarly situated people become impacted differently. And in some cases, like LaTanya Sweeney from Harvard says, people with Black sounding names, for example, may get higher interest rates, or there may be associations of photos that are tied to one's suitability for employment. That then becomes disparate impact. And why the training data is very important. What you put into the model will depend or actually impact what comes out of the model. And there's a lot of technical conversation that you can sort of correct the training data over when it's overrepresented or underrepresented. And many of us PhDs do that, right? We actually are able to weight the data differently to ensure that we see what the variances are. But in the case of the marketplace where these algorithms are being deployed, we often see, for example, training data that is either underrepresented. So facial recognition technologies, which are designed to actually identify our face, come with very limited facial cues for Black people. and Black women and various complexions. And it doesn't work well if the lighting is off. Or, I tell people all the time, I hear often from companies, well, facial recognition still has a long way to go when it comes to Black women who change their hair, which I do often, which means I cannot utilize the technology. In some cases, it means that you may be misidentified if the facial recognition is in the hands of law enforcement. So that's the underrepresented side. We've also found on the overrepresented side, when people are using algorithms for criminal justice decisions, for example, they rely upon mugshot data with facial recognition. Well, who do we know is overrepresented in mugshot data? So that also becomes problematic because you're obviously going to find that person easier because of the kinds of systemic inequalities in the criminal justice system. So those things play out on the training data, I think, in very different ways. And they have, again, either a disparate impact on populations who have already had a series of opportunities foreclosed on them, which is why I kind of agree with you, Doc, on the side of, there's always correction. And I'm a huge tech geek. I know that there are very good use cases of AI, but I worry that even if we were to say that there is a way to use algorithms to actually correct bias, how can you do that when you don't understand the sociological implications of certain use cases? You have to know when you're going into the equation that those challenges are going to exist. And with, I tell people, I add to these labels of responsible, transparent, explainable, and I add two things to it: inclusive AI and legal AI. And I can talk more about the civil rights compliance, but I think at the end of the day, you have to have inclusive models that not only bring people together by backgrounds, but also by disciplines, so that you can begin to avert where are there some obvious blind spots in the training data that may create a positive, a precise prediction. Yes, this person should be, have a longer sentence or less long sentence because of recidivism. But at the end of the day, even if you have reduced the lack of non-reliability of a model, you still are placing that model in a flawed environment. And so I've been working on stuff to sort of talk that out with people because I think that oftentimes we take it for granted.
So thank you for that really clear explanation of some of the basics of the things that we're talking about today, the terminology that we're using and so on. I'd really like to go back now to that term that you used, or that question that you asked at the very beginning, Dr. Turner-Lee, who's at the table? And I'll start actually by directing this to Professor Brauneiss, and then encourage the two of you to have a little bit of back and forth on this. As I see it, there are at least 3 points at which we might ask who should be at the table. There's the moment where the algorithms are being designed, which typically involves engineers. There is the moment at which those algorithms are being implemented, which, depending on the use case, can have a variety of different actors, taking a look, evaluating. And then, of course, there's the actual evaluation phase where people are looking at the outcomes. And again, we see a really diverse array depending on the various use cases. Thinking about those three, Professor Brauneiss, who would you really want at the table when we're building, implementing, and evaluating algorithms?
No, that's a wonderful question, and at least from the point of view of algorithms that will be deployed publicly, I think that you have to realize that whether they know it or not, engineers are making policy decisions, and ideally, you want representatives of the governments and of the constituents about whom those policy decisions are being made to be involved in constructing the algorithm, right? Part of this, however, is a question of business models and economics. And one of the things that Professor Ellen Goodman and I found when we tried to elicit through open records requests from governments information about their algorithms is that first of all, almost no government that we asked for information from had in-house expertise, right? So no public official is the engineer building the algorithm. It is all done through government contracting, right? And so we already have a kind of agency problem where the public official is trying to somehow interact with the engineer who is not a public employee and who is working for a company that has a profit motive in designing the algorithm. But beyond that, there are some algorithms, and Compass is certainly one of them, in which the business model of the developer is to resell essentially the same algorithm to many different agencies. And if that's their business model, then they are kind of worried about trade secrecy, because if it gets out exactly what they've done, then their next customer may not have to come to them. They may go to somebody who's just copied what North Point, now Equivant, who is the developer of Compass, has done. So if we've got that kind of business model where you're reselling this to many different agencies, then sort of the ability to have some transparent interaction between government and officials and the developer is burdened. The agencies that we found that did have more to share and were willing to share it were those for whom algorithms were being developed sort of on a bespoke basis. They engaged a contractor to build a predictive algorithm from the ground up just for them, using just data from their jurisdiction. And then the motivations of the company are different, because they're not quite so worried that their business model is going to be undermined. Now, it's true that sometimes the government clients also have an interest in secrecy, just because they're worried about bad press and opening this up and looking into a can of worms. So I think there were definitely governments that will happily sign non-disclosure agreements with the contractors, because they could then say to anybody who wanted information, "Oh, sorry, we signed a non-disclosure agreement," when part of their worry was just not opening themselves up to criticism as governments. But that's a sort of a first attempt, I think, to answer your question about, yeah, people should be involved from the get-go, including those who the decisions are affecting. But there are sort of various dynamics involved in that if not prevent, at least weigh against that kind of transparency and involvement.
Yeah. Well, if you want me to jump in, Rebecca, I'll respond a little bit to what we've heard so far. I mean, I think if I can jump in on the government side, I do think it's important for governments to develop standards and norms, as well as principles on procurement of AI products and services. I think oftentimes government sees the harnessing of efficiency in these new shiny objects and applications. But as was mentioned, they don't have the people who can actually go in and say, hey, this part of this code is not working, or we might want to do X, because they're not staffed up with folks who actually understand the algorithmic process or the modeling or the execution or auditing. With that being the case, I think it's important for government to have some set principles on what they expect from these models when they purchase it from companies. Things like, and I can jump into the civil rights compliance, that this is going to be a lawful algorithm, right? It's not going to create a disparate impact that will essentially violate an individual's employment, credit, housing, risk, healthcare risk, et cetera, and that it's something that is trustworthy in that sense that the developer has taken that into consideration. We expect that from other products and services in the government. I don't know why we don't expect it from machine learning algorithms, first and foremost. I think it's also important that government, and I've been talking about this lately, set up advisory councils to really monitor the algorithm's progress. I think within an advisory of people who come from mixed departments or different disciplines, they can actually have a conversation on how is this algorithm performing. I mean, the core of my work, I look at this as, not a black or white thing, honestly, but a performance metric, right? And the extent to which the algorithm is performing to what it said it could actually do. If an algorithm is creating disparate treatment or impact, then it's not performing at the level that it actually was espoused to be able to do, and that's a problem. I'm reminded of an example in Allegheny County, for example, where they they used an algorithm to help with the non-abused child cases. So people who call this hotline, and they decided to put an algorithm in instead. And they found out after many months that this was actually putting more Black and brown kids into foster care. That was an outside company who did it. I actually cited to that work. The outside company called me and said, no, Dr. Lee, we fixed this, right? After finding the outcome. But think about all the kids, again, that were impacted by that mistake or error. So I do think it's really important on the case of reputational risk that governments think about the impact in those use cases that are very important to their constituencies. I think we should see some of the same cadence in the private sector. Private sector often just looks to models because they want to beat the next company when it comes to the next great app. And that's somewhat problematic because, again, as a PhD, it doesn't provide the type of cushion to determine whether or not there's going to be disparate impact or differential treatment. And I think it's important then for there to be a cross-pollination of ideas of humans and tech so that it's not just tech first and then humans later. Sort of like, let's not build it so people fall and there's increased liability. Let's build it with some level of understanding of the risk involved with that automated decision. And I want to go back to Pa's point. At the end of the day, what happens is if companies don't realize this, they have much more reputational risk by not putting these guardrails in place at the beginning. So I think, when you ask that question, Rebecca, who should be at the table, I think they should hire more social scientists as work in tech companies. I think that there should be more lawyers. I think there should be more privacy experts and ethicists, period. And I think they should teach that in courses where it's much more interdisciplinary for students in computer science so they understand what the social sciences are. So, at the end of the day, you need a mix of people to be able to actually address, I think, again, not whether or not we like the same earrings and they're different, but again, these sensitive use cases that have bigger impact.
So I don't think that you will get any complaint for the others on this call about including more social scientists and lawyers and so on. But I want to ask the two of you about before I get to that, I realize we have a question from the audience that fits in very nicely to what we were just talking about. So one of our audience members, Melissa Newcomb, is asking about what civil society's role might be in this. And I started my question by asking, about these different phases of the kind of AI moment. How should civil society actors be involved in these discussions? The focus, Dr. Turner-Lee, that you gave was on more kind of expertise being there, specific disciplines and so on. Professor Brauneis, you talked about kind of openness and transparency into the algorithms themselves. Where in this equation do we get representatives from civil society involved?
Well, I can say a few sentences about them. I'm sure Dr. Turner-Lee will have other things to say about that. We as academics doing research filed a whole bunch of Open Records Act requests to try to bring some algorithms into the sunshine. Doesn't have to be academics. There are a lot of civil society organizations that whose bread and butter is filing Open Records Act requests and trying to sort of understand what governments are doing with algorithms, and doing kind of analysis. I also think civil society can propose models for greater accountability and involvement. The kind of advisory boards and so on that Dr. Turner-Lee was talking about. I mean, who would put such things together, particularly if we might be dealing with a situation where, and I think this is quite likely, where you're not always going to have the money to have a custom built algorithm for each local government. And so you have to build new structures in which an algorithm that's being produced perhaps by a private contractor for a whole group of local governments is subject to evaluation and so forth. Civil society organizations could definitely become involved in creating and maintaining those kinds of structures. And although I guess I've been kind of harping on the public side in terms of private use of these algorithms in the context that Dr. Turner-Lee mentioned, like credit scoring and employment decisions, right? Private contexts in which these kind of consequential decisions are being made privately, I definitely think there's a role for civil society in monitoring those as well. And on the legal side, thinking about how do these new fintech companies that are producing new kinds of credit scoring, how can they be held accountable if necessary by thinking about what the Fair Credit Reporting Act requires and what the Equal Credit Opportunity Act requires, things like that.
Mm-hmm. So this is a really interesting question on civil society's role. So I'll sort of add in another take as well. I've been working on this piece, which sort of models what we're seeing in Germany and other parts of the EU, which is around labeling and certification, and the extent to which we know what goes into the technical cadence, as well as what are the structural legalities of what can be collected in terms of privacy, or how a model works against civil rights, so human rights laws. And then the third stool that I've been looking at, and I've been putting it under this umbrella called an Energy Star rating, is civil society engagement. I think it's so interesting as a technologist that we can provide comments for just about everything in society, whether or not we want this hotel or this other hotel, we like this product, we don't like this product. But we haven't had the opportunity to say whether or not an algorithm is performing to the positive or the affirmative of our experiences. And I think that's important. I think civil society should be able to inform companies when they launch algorithms in terms of performance, whether or not, I just changed my hair algorithm and it's not letting me open my phone, or I just got misidentified. And there's no channel that exists. And I was on a conference the other day and someone said it's almost like the consumer pressure of civil society to get companies to do better. And I think that's about right. I think that we have to have that engagement from everyday people. I would also say the second thing is there are opportunities of civil society to also be informed. Oftentimes, civil society cannot distinguish when a decision is being made by an algorithm or by a human person. And so we've seen examples in the fintech space, for example, or in the credit scoring space, where Credit Karma may have the same type of preciseness as the accredited credit agencies, but people don't understand that you just can't walk into a car dealer and say, my Credit Karma scores at X, because it's not often disclosed that they're actually compiling a lot of data to make that prediction. And then I think third, where civil society can be helpful, it can be helpful if we were able to develop, and Dr. Brown has actually talked about this, sort of a co-evolution of design, where in the fintech space, for example, we use what we call regulatory sandboxes and safe harbors to allow companies to sort of work with real people to determine whether or not that product was going to work effectively or was going to be biased. I think we have some opportunities when we begin to look at healthcare algorithms, for example, that test pain thresholds on men versus women, that maybe we want to add a few more women into that equation, or algorithms where the training data is flawed or the outcome is just too great, that we should be thinking about how do we engage civil society in those ways. And I talk to a lot of researchers as well as private sector entities in government to ask them this question all the time. What's your benchmark data? Have you actually received input? Have you asked anybody whether or not this product works for them or the algorithm performs a certain way? And they often say no, because the way that the internet is designed it's designed along the lines of being very opaque, but there's also sort of this unspoken truth that says that you can't ask those questions. So you have to rely on inferences. What do I know about that person based on their likes, their interests, their affinity groups, versus really asking people. And so I think as we look at this area, it's very important to engage civil society, because I think civil society can help us to, I think, bring the type of transparency, as well as ensure that we're not creating consequences with some of the algorithmic systems that really matter.
If you don't mind, I'd like to take a minute or two just to focus a little bit more on one of the ideas that you raised towards the beginning, Dr. Turner-Lee, about civil society being key in giving consumer feedback. So this has a really kind of face value appeal to it, for sure. And particularly when we think about the fact that, on, for example, social media platforms, users are able to submit reports for certain types of content, but they're not necessarily submitting reports about, oh, you seem to have assumed this about me, Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat, but actually you got this wrong, right? Here's who I really am. There's something intuitively appealing about that. I wonder, though, or I worry, would that really be used as an accountability mechanism? Or would that ultimately become more training data and little else for these proprietary algorithms? How do we actually make sure that consumer feedback is used in a way that is ultimately serving the grander public good rather than the private commercial interests?
Well, I love that question. I think at the end of the day, and you had sent both of us an article that Karen Howe, and you referenced the MIT article. I think at the end of the day, what we're seeing is the algorithmic economy is doing exactly what it was meant to do, right? Which is to polarize and sort of place us into the boxes based on our interests, likes, tastes, affinities, etc. And the more that they know about us, the more engagement that there is, and the more optimized these platforms are for the profit of their shareholders. With that being the case, I do agree with you. That's why I said I think collecting this information comes under public policy coevolution with companies, right? So it does not happen as a market stop, but it's basically a way to check that algorithm to ensure that it works. We do that now when it comes to, public health testing, vaccination testing, but we don't do that, I think, in areas where there are going to be determinations that will foreclose on opportunities of folks in ways that will be hard to actually regress. I'll give you a perfect example. Just a couple of years ago, Facebook allowed the developers to design a tool for housing eligibility that checked people off. Now, the lawyers out there know under the Fair Housing Act, you can't check people off. You have to check people in. So from a technical cadence stance, it was a no-no. That case is still being argued. HUD just put out a disparate impact rule. We're still there. And the part that bothers me the most about this is even if we fix the disparate impact rule and we ensure that people who are eligible for public housing, for example, could see other ads, the bottom line is that the way the technology is designed, they will still not see those ads because the algorithmic economy is so strong that it guides you towards, again, your affinity, likes, tastes, and I tell people it's like being on a playground. When I was growing up, there was a playground with monkey bars, a slide, a swing, sandbox. And guess what? When we were in physical space, we went from the monkey bars to the sandbox to the swing. In the algorithmic economy, we stay in the sandbox, we stay on the swings. And that strength of that relationship and affinity becomes stronger, not recognizing that the people that are in the sandbox are the white supremacists, the people that are on the swing of the Black Lives Matter folks, the people who are sitting, on the side looking at the monkey bars might be the people who are just looking at low-income housing. And that part of it, I think, is where we are in this country when it begins to think, and I love the way Dr. Ryan actually started his comments, when we think about the democratization of information and whether or not these models can actually do that. And so, yeah, I'm one of those folks that I think that these need to be done in controlled environments. We need to assess any harm, much like the fintech process did with regulatory sandboxes. But I am concerned, like you, that the more data that we provide, the more likely we're going to see the concentration and polarization of people, where you will still be stuck within the trajectories of poverty and isolation and interest without actually getting out of there and having future opportunities.
And just let me add to tie it back to the questioner's question about roles for civil society. Yeah, providing information directly to the for-profit companies may well ensure that they're just using that as more training data. And so a role of a civil society nonprofit that is committed to certain principles that are not profit maximizing, if that entity is the entity that receives the reviews and incorporates them into some kind of Energy Star rating, which could include not just direct consumer feedback, but could include other kinds of metrics, like as you, Dr. Tromble, said, how involved were affected people in the design of this algorithm. You can imagine that as one score, and another score, well, how much training was done so that people who are using this prediction as an input to their human decision understand what the meaning of that prediction is, right? And how often is this algorithm subject to evaluation? Those are kind of different levels in which a kind of entrepreneurial civil society organization could produce a kind of offer an Energy Star rating, and some companies, and it could come to be passed, but companies would think, well, I kind of really need that. My competitor has it, and I'm losing some ground to them because they have a good score, and I'm out here in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, no, if I could jump in there, look, you must be reading my mind, Dr. Roberts, because that's what going into all my notes. I have interviewed all these companies and everybody's different, but there's some things like, secondary, tertiary testing, those questions that you're asking to me are important. And I've told people, like, in the United States, we may not necessarily need a regulatory regime like we're seeing in the UK and other places, but this better housekeeping seal concept, or this understanding that the algorithm is performing in the way it's supposed to. The reason I labeled it an Energy Star rating is I was buying a dishwasher and I was looking for the big yellow sticker, because that told me how this dishwasher was going to perform. And I think with the movement to the digital economy, we're there. So we need that type of input to make sure that people know what is trustworthy in terms of where they put their data and how it actually processes it.
I think this is probably a good opportunity for us to, at least mention or highlight that there are some civil society organizations doing this very work. Professor Brauneis, when you were describing some of these specific questions that groups might be asking, I was immediately thinking about the work of Ranking Digital Rights. Such excellent work that this group and many others are doing in this space. But ultimately, the question is, are they doing it alone, right? What sort of support do they need in order to make sure that people really can understand what's happening with these algorithms, what the consequences are? And so that turns me to the question of accountability and how we ultimately achieve accountability. And of course, ultimately, do we need regulation of some form? And what does that ultimately need to look like? Professor Brauneis, do you want to start us off?
Well, I guess so. The answer is that we already have some of that regulation, which is to say, we may not have regulation that was specifically designed to deal with the use of predictive algorithms, but as Dr. Turner-Lee mentioned, in the areas of credit and employment and housing, we do have regulations that say that you cannot be biased in these ways, and sometimes it refers to disparate impact, and sometimes it has an intent component, but those regulations are out there, and then the problem, that problem may be, well, so but how do we apply those and translate those to the algorithm, because previously they were being used with human decision makers, right, rather than with algorithms. And one thing I would mention here in terms of what that regulation will look like, is that there's been a lot of discussion recently, and I know part of the blurb for this event was recent developments and so on. There's been a lot of discussion recently about how the efficacy of sort of large scale training data and its processing with machine learning algorithms may have to change our concepts about points of regulation. Older models sort of assume that if you restricted inputs, if you made sure that a model was blind to the question of the race or the gender or the religion of a subject, then you would get an unbiased decision, because of course, if the person who's evaluating this applicant does not know what this applicant's race or gender are. And I think of recent stories about how when auditions for orchestras started using blinds, more women started becoming accepted into orchestras, right? I mean, that's just, there's a powerful notion there that, well, if we restrict the inputs, then we're going to make things more fair. And lots of work and thought has been done more recently on the problem that machine learning algorithms can sort of intuit or draw correlations about race, gender, religion, whatever else, from seemingly innocuous points of data by themselves, which either by themselves or in combination can be used to predict all these things. And that leads us to the question about whether in a model of algorithmic regulation, we have to be very careful about thinking that restricting inputs is going to do much of anything to ensure fairness, and whether we need to move to an outputs-based sort of evaluation, which for some is controversial, because it seems like, oh, well, then you're kind of making sure that outputs are equal and balancing and so on. But there may be no alternative.
Dr. Turner-Lee, what would you add?
Yeah, so I'm gonna, because I know we're running short of time, I'll just sort of put in a 5-point plan. That's what we do best at Think Tanks. We just come up with like constructs. So I think first and foremost, the first point of the 5-point plan, if we think about, where do we go from here, is we obviously need a federal privacy standard. So a lot of the challenges that we have when we talk about the algorithmic economy is the fact that, gathering data is just a wild, wild west. And so we really need to think about what data is being collected, how consumers know or own that data, the extent to which that data is repurposed, and the extent to which consumers have some empowerment or ownership to be able to look or appeal some of those decisions. And that's basically a conversation for another panel, but without federal privacy legislation, it becomes very hard. I also think that I like what we're talking about in terms of civil rights compliance under existing statutes and laws, but I think it's just not enough. I think there's an opportunity to actually visit some of those civil rights statutes and laws, because we are no longer in like the lunch counter moment anymore. These algorithms are so opaque that sometimes we don't even know, unless we're sitting next to somebody, what we see and what we do not see. And that, to me, is the most frightening thing, because it's very hard to mitigate that. When we had in the 2016 election foreign interference in terms of manipulating and exploiting certain populations, that was something that we didn't know where it came from, and people didn't know that their rights were being suppressed. And so I think it's important to be very clear that we have some compliance on the technical side. And I think it's important for, if you're going to build an employment algorithm, you need to know what the EEOC laws are. And that's something that is part of this Energy Star rating I've been working on. I think it's also important, the third part, is that we think about maybe partnering with Congress, the National Science Foundation, to get more inclusive and diverse data sets developed. And that, I think, is an opportunity for universities versus private companies, consultancies, to actually engage in really quality research with the help of some more appropriation in those areas. I think having those allows agencies like NIST to just have better data sets that can be provided to companies that want to look at these very hard issues. I would say fourth, we have a new president, and this should obviously be something on his radar. And so it'd be great to see President Biden put together a presidential commission or advisory just on this conversation. We are coming out of a period of COVID where the algorithm economy is doing a lot. We're coming out of a period of extremism where we're actually seeing the internet play a role in that. Some would put this as an information breakdown. I actually see it as a combination of everything. Misinformation doesn't happen by itself as a bubble. It gets amplified through algorithmic amplification. So I think it's important that the president pay attention to this. And then I would say the fifth point of my 5-point plan goes back to government. Government does have a level of responsibility the private sector does not have. And so I think it's an important moment for some more collaboration and cooperation among state and local governments to come up with their procurement principles. And that would be a wonderful exercise for them to at least say, you know, these are the things that we would like to have, you know, even if it's the NDA or it's just the proclamation of a company that is going to be compliant with civil rights, but something like that, government should actually do that. And I would just put out a shameless plug. We at Brookings are actually trying to do a project, since you told me it's the media department and the law school, that is actually around looking at disparate impact and civil rights laws in this new algorithmic economy. I'd welcome any student to reach me on LinkedIn who's interested in this kind of project, because I think what we find is that there's just a dearth of information. It's such a new topic, it's nascent, but at the same time, it's nascently fast. And so the more that we can actually have some more conversation or researchers interested in this, I think the further we'll be able to go.
That's really great. And I love the idea of sort of wrapping up our conversation with an actual plan of action in our hands. So thank you for providing a very concrete 5-point plan for us to move forward. There's so much more that we could dig into. 1 hour was not enough. One of the really pressing questions that I wanted to ask, and we just don't have time for, is really who bias against or for whom are we, you know, really concerned about? Many other things that we just weren't able to dig into. So to wrap up, I really want to encourage the members of our audience to look more at the work that Dr. Turner Lee and the Brookings Institute are doing, that Professor Brauneis and those at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics are working on, many others, because this is such a rich, diverse, developing field that has incredible impacts on our everyday lives in ways that both Professor Brauneis and Dr. Turner Lee have highlighted we often don't recognize. We simply can't see. These are invisible impacts that are often happening to us. So for all who attended, thank you so much. Please keep engaging in these issues. Professor Brauneis, Dr. Turner Lee, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us. I hope that we'll be able to continue it at another time and in different venues, and someday back in person, since I believe we're all basically in the DC area. It would be lovely. Until then, I hope everyone has a great week, great month, a great rest of the year. Be safe, be healthy, be well. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.